If you are an empath, you were likely taught very early in life to feel others before you felt yourself. Not because you were weak, but because you were attuned. You learned to read the room, sense the shift in energy, anticipate emotional danger, and adapt. That sensitivity became your survival skill. But here is the truth few people tell you. Your empathy was born from necessity, not from abundance. Empathy often begins not as a gift, but as a necessity. In early environments where emotions were unpredictable, inconsistent, or overwhelming, a child learns to pay close attention, not out of curiosity, but out of survival. They become skilled at noticing subtle changes in tone, facial expression, and mood because those signals determine safety. When love feels conditional or conflict feels dangerous, sensitivity becomes protection. In such spaces, the child's own needs quietly move into the background. Expressing anger, sadness, or fear may feel risky, so those feelings are suppressed. Instead, attention turns outward. Who is upset? Who needs calming? What must be done to keep the emotional balance intact? Over time, this external focus becomes automatic, deeply wired into the nervous system. Empathy is no longer a choice, it is a reflex. This heightened awareness is often praised. The empath is called mature, carrying understanding beyond their years. But what is rarely acknowledged is the cost. The ability to feel others so deeply develops alongside a disconnection from one's own internal world. The body holds tension, the mind stays alert. Rest feels unsafe because vigilance once kept connection intact. As adulthood arrives, the pattern continues. The empath senses discomfort before words are spoken. They anticipate needs, soften conflicts, absorb emotional weight that does not belong to them. They may feel responsible for how others feel, believing that harmony depends on their presence and effort. This is not generosity born from abundance, but from conditioning shaped by early emotional responsibility. Because this empathy was formed in an atmosphere of uncertainty, boundaries can feel unfamiliar or even threatening. Saying no may trigger guilt. Pulling back may feel like abandonment. The nervous system interprets distance as danger even when distance is healthy, so the empath stays available, open, giving, even when depleted. The body, however, remembers the original reason empathy formed. Chronic fatigue, anxiety, emotional overwhelm, and a sense of invisibility often emerge. These are not signs of weakness. They are signals that the survival strategy is still running long after the threat has passed. Empathy, in this light, is not something that defines who a person is, but something that once helped them endure. When seen this way, sensitivity no longer needs to be romanticized or exploited. It can be understood, regulated, and slowly separated from the belief that love requires constant emotional vigilance. Overgiving often disguises itself as kindness, compassion, or strength, but beneath the surface it is frequently a response to unresolved emotional patterns. When someone learns early on that love is earned through usefulness, they begin to associate giving with safety. Helping becomes a way to stay connected, to avoid rejection, and to maintain emotional stability in relationships that once felt uncertain. What looks like generosity is often rooted in fear of disconnection. In overgiving, attention consistently flows outward. The needs, emotions, and crises of others take priority, while personal limits are ignored or dismissed. There is a belief, often unconscious, that one more effort, one more sacrifice, will finally create harmony or appreciation. Yet this cycle rarely leads to genuine healing for anyone involved. Instead, it reinforces imbalance. When people receive support without being encouraged to engage their own inner resources, growth is delayed. They may feel temporarily soothed, but the deeper patterns remain untouched. Responsibility is subtly transferred to the giver, who becomes an emotional regulator for others. This dynamic can create dependence rather than empowerment, closeness without authenticity, connection without mutual presence. For the one who gives too much, the cost accumulates quietly. Emotional exhaustion sets in. The body tightens, sleep becomes shallow, and a constant sense of pressure lingers. There may be resentment that feels shameful, because it conflicts with the self-image of being caring and selfless. Yet this resentment is not a moral failure. It is a signal that inner boundaries have been crossed too many times. True healing requires space for discomfort. It requires allowing others to experience the consequences of their emotions and choices without immediately intervening. Overgiving removes that space. It smooths over pain too quickly, preventing insight and self-responsibility from developing. In doing so, it also prevents the giver from honoring their own limits. Compassion does not demand self-erasure. Care does not require depletion. When giving comes from obligation rather than choice, it becomes a form of self-abandonment. Healing begins not when everything is fixed for others, but when giving is guided by presence, clarity, and respect for the body's signals. In that shift, support becomes grounded, relationships become more honest, and energy is no longer drained in the name of love. The need to be needed often forms in environments where affection was inconsistent or conditional. When love arrives only in response to usefulness, helpfulness, or emotional availability, a quiet belief takes root that worth must be earned. Being needed becomes a substitute for being chosen, a way to secure connection in the absence of emotional safety. Over time, usefulness starts to feel like love. In this pattern, attention is directed toward what others require rather than who one is. The question becomes how to remain indispensable, how to anticipate needs before they are spoken, how to stay relevant in the emotional lives of others. The relationship feels active and intense, yet something essential is missing. The person is valued for what they provide, not for their inner experience. Being loved, in contrast, does not demand constant performance. It does not require emotional labor as proof of worth. Love allows space for imperfection, rest, and disagreement. It remains present even when nothing is being given. For those conditioned to equate love with usefulness, this kind of connection can feel unfamiliar or even uncomfortable. Without the role of caretaker or fixer, there may be a sense of emptiness or fear of becoming invisible. When being needed is mistaken for being loved, relationships often become unbalanced. One person carries the emotional weight, offers stability, and absorbs distress, while the other leans without learning to stand. The connection may feel deep, but it is sustained by dependency rather than mutual presence. Over time, the one who is needed may feel drained, unseen, or quietly resentful even as they continue to give. This dynamic also limits authenticity. Expressing needs, fatigue, or boundaries risks disrupting the role that secures connection. So emotions are filtered, vulnerability is managed, and the self is shaped around what will keep others close. Love becomes something to maintain rather than something to experience. Recognizing the difference between being needed and being loved can be unsettling. It invites grief for relationships built on imbalance and challenges beliefs about worth. Yet it also opens the possibility of connection rooted in mutual respect. Being loved means being allowed to exist without proving value, to be met rather than relied upon, to be held without being required to hold everything together. Sensitivity, warmth, and emotional openness create a kind of presence that others can feel immediately. There is a natural pull toward those who listen deeply, who offer understanding without judgment, who carry steadiness in emotional storms. This inner light is not something learned, it emerges from awareness, compassion, and lived experience. But when it remains unprotected, it does not only attract connection, it attracts consumption. People who are disconnected from their own inner world often seek regulation through others. They may not intend harm, yet they are drawn to those who can hold what they cannot. The unprotected empath becomes a source of grounding, reassurance, and emotional containment. Over time, interactions shift subtly. Conversations revolve around one person's pain. Presence turns into availability. Care becomes expectation. Without clear boundaries, giving feels endless. The light that once flowed naturally begins to feel extracted. There is little pause, little reciprocity, little awareness of the toll being taken. The empath may sense fatigue, irritation, or a vague sense of being used, yet struggle to name it. Conditioning often teaches that stepping back is unkind, that limits are selfish, that endurance is love. Consumption thrives in this silence. When no boundaries are spoken, others assume access. When access is assumed, responsibility disappears. The empath absorbs emotional residue that does not belong to them, carrying it in the body as tension, heaviness, or depletion. The nervous system remains activated, scanning for others' needs while neglecting its own signals. This pattern does not require malicious intent. Often, those who consume are unaware. They are seeking relief, not domination. But lack of awareness does not lessen the impact. Energy is finite. Emotional presence requires recovery. Without protection, even the most resilient light begins to dim. Protection does not mean withdrawal or hardness. It means discernment. It means noticing when connection becomes draining rather than nourishing. It means recognizing when empathy is being accessed without consent. Boundaries are not walls. They are filters that determine what enters and what stays outside. When light is protected, It no longer leaks into spaces where it is not honored. It becomes steady rather than scattered. Relationships shift, some fade, others deepen. The energy once consumed begins to return inward, restoring clarity, balance, and a sense of inner ownership that had quietly been lost. Boundaries are often misunderstood as rejection, distance, or emotional coldness, especially by those who learned early that connection depends on availability. For people who are sensitive and attuned to others, limits can feel threatening, as though saying no risks abandonment or conflict. Yet boundaries are not about pushing others away. They are about staying connected to oneself. Self-respect begins with recognizing that the body and nervous system carry wisdom. Fatigue, irritation, numbness, and overwhelm are not flaws in character. They are messages that something essential is being crossed. When those signals are ignored repeatedly, the self is slowly abandoned in the name of harmony. Boundaries interrupt that pattern by honoring internal experience as valid and worthy of care. Setting limits requires clarity. It asks for awareness of what is sustainable and what is not, what feels aligned and what feels invasive. This clarity is not always immediate. For many, it develops through discomfort and trial, through noticing when giving turns into depletion. Boundaries emerge not from rigidity, but from listening inward and responding honestly. There is often guilt that accompanies this process. Saying no can trigger old fears of being seen as selfish or unloving. Yet self-respect cannot grow where self-betrayal continues. Each time a boundary is honored, the nervous system learns safety in truth rather than safety in compliance. Over time, this creates a steadiness that does not depend on external approval. Healthy boundaries also reshape relationships. They reveal which connections are rooted in mutual respect and which rely on overextension. Some relationships strengthen when limits are introduced, becoming more honest and balanced. Others fade when access is no longer unlimited. This loss can be painful, but it clarifies what was being valued. Boundaries do not remove compassion. They give it direction. When limits are clear, giving becomes a choice rather than an obligation. Presence becomes grounded rather than resentful. The energy once scattered across unmet expectations begins to consolidate. Self-respect is not an abstract concept. It is practiced in small moments of truth, in pauses before overcommitting, in listening to discomfort instead of overriding it. Boundaries are the language through which the self is acknowledged. They say, without explanation or defense, that one's time, energy, and emotional world matter. In that acknowledgement, a deeper sense of dignity takes root, allowing connection to exist without the cost of self-erasure. For those who have spent a lifetime attuned to others, the idea of turning empathy inward can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. Attention has long been directed outward, scanning for shifts in mood, unspoken needs, and emotional undercurrents. This outward focus once served a purpose, helping maintain connection and safety. Yet over time, it leaves little space to notice what is happening inside. Awakening begins not by becoming more aware of others, but by finally allowing awareness to rest within. Turning empathy inward means meeting one's own experience with the same patience and curiosity offered to others. Instead of dismissing fatigue, it is listened to. Instead of overriding sadness, it is acknowledged. The body is no longer treated as an obstacle to productivity, but as a source of information. This shift is subtle but profound. It interrupts the habit of self-neglect that has often been mistaken for strength. Many resist this inward turn because it feels selfish or indulgent. Old beliefs surface, suggesting that attention should be reserved for those who need it more. Yet empathy without inclusion of the self becomes imbalance. When compassion flows in only one direction, it eventually collapses under its own weight. Bringing empathy inward restores equilibrium. This inward attention also reveals emotions that have long been postponed. Grief, anger, fear, and longing may surface once they are no longer suppressed. This can feel destabilizing at first. But these emotions are not new. They are simply being given permission to exist. Healing does not require fixing them, only staying present without judgment. As self-empathy deepens, the nervous system begins to settle. There is less urgency to manage others, less anxiety around approval. Choices become clearer because they are guided by internal signals rather than external demands. The sense of identity shifts from what is given to who is being. This is where awakening takes shape, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet return. A return to the body, to sensation, to personal truth. Empathy inward creates space for authenticity, allowing boundaries to form naturally and relationships to rebalance. It transforms sensitivity from a burden into a resource that is consciously directed. When empathy includes the self, light no longer leaks outward in search of validation. It stabilizes, becoming steady rather than reactive. From this place, connection remains possible, but it is no longer compulsory. Awareness rests where it was always meant to be, within one's own experience. When you turn your empathy inward, something remarkable happens. Your body softens. Your mind quiets. Your intuition sharpens. And your light, the one others fed on, begins to return to you, not louder, not brighter for others, but steady, whole, and finally yours.